Hey guys, so of course we're in a new format and Dragon Link of course did get a bit of a hit on that last list. So basically what I did was I surveyed players in the Dragon Link Facebook as well as Discord duelist groups just to gather their thoughts in terms of what they believe are the key strengths, the key weaknesses, and as well as what they're going to do post ban list regarding this deck. So definitely a huge thanks to all of you that responded. 51 players responded, so certainly also follow me on Twitter if you don't want to miss out on these kind of surveys because I have done this with a variety of different meta strategies and will continue to do so as well. Now, before we continue, big thanks to my sponsors as always. Definitely go check out those discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles as well as sealed and also supplies. And actually, speaking of dragons, also a big thanks to Dragon Shield for the hookup with some of their new sleeves. You can certainly check those out using my affiliate link. You can also get custom sleeves from Dragon Shield as well. And also, speaking of dragons even further, Team Sam also has this really incredible playmat available for sale as of yesterday. So you can certainly use my code Akuna10 for 10% off on playmats or even sleeves as well. Alright, so let's just get to the results of this survey. So for one, in terms of how difficult the deck is to pilot, at least among the Dragon Link players, they kind of put it on an average around 7.7, which is of course respectable. I actually thought it would be even higher because I know that this deck has been quite for a long time known to be very difficult to deck to pilot really well, but certainly in the range there. Now, in terms of what tier Dragon Link players would categorize this deck now post ban list, 2/3 actually put it at tier 2. I think heading into this prior list, essentially they were still in that tier 1 contention. At best maybe the best of tier 2, but I think really it wasn't that tier 1 argument. Now I think tier 2 is definitely fair. It did get some consistency hits, but it didn't get any absolute killer unplayable kind of hits. So it's still really good, and I think this is pretty fair. Okay, so let's cover some of the key strengths of Dragon Link, and I tried my best to summarize the key themes that came up on the survey. And the first was, the flexibility, the utility of the extra deck. Aside from the Dragon specific cards, they can at least still play something like, let's say, Barone, as well as something like IP into Unicorn, things like that, as well as strong recovery. This is something that the deck has always been quite known for the last little while. Of course, when they initially got that hit on Striker Dragon a couple of years ago, that definitely hurt their grind game. But at the same time, with the release of Bishios, they've definitely kind of recovered in that sense as well. And actually ability to play combo, mid-range, and control. It actually kind of relates to the release of Bestials. Traditionally this was always a very heavy combo kind of strategy in terms of dragons, but now it's actually with has a way to play Bestial control. Also kind of depends on the hand as well. Sometimes you don't have a choice but to play it that way. But something like with the Bestials and regain allowing to give you extra bodies, some draws, and the beast also providing some pops as well. Definitely can play a variety of different play styles. Also being able to play through a variety of interruptions, except for Shifter, which we will get to, but for the most part, other hand traps, they're still going to be able to do pretty well and play through it. Strong matchup against any light or dark deck. This is definitely true for any deck that plays a lot of Bestials, and of course right now Dragon Link is the deck that is playing a lot of Bestials, and this is sort of when the Bestials first came out last year, and this is sort of during the tier format already, but at the same time this is where it really hurt a lot of rogue decks. I found you think about decks like, let's say, my beloved Cyber Dragons, you have something like Drytron, you have something like even Owlwitch, or let's say, I don't know, even Sky Striker. It really suffered a lot once the Bestials came out, because it turns out a lot of decks play light and dark, so definitely a really strong matchup there. And then just ability to set up turn 1, really strong. Might not be as oppressive as it once was. Let's say back in the early days of the pandemic, they had the Buster Whelp block, which essentially meant you could not go into the extra deck. That really sucked. We're not in those kind of stages anymore, but it's still a pretty formidable board, and layered interruptions as well, actually a little bit different than what it used to be. And then also just its ability to break boards going second as well. Now, in terms of the typical end board, Dragon Link players are ending, especially again post ban list, but at the same time, from what I've seen in the survey, it didn't really change too much in terms of the end board compared to what it is leading up to this ban list. And it's of course a little bit varied depending on the hand. The most common response was kind of a combination of these cards that you have to be familiar with. Of course, Heretic Seal is kind of by worst case default that can always go into this, essentially providing a non-targeting bounce, as well as being able to also special summon. And so for example, let's say you could special something like Magma Nut and then just get a search at the end phase and just get some recovery there. The Boral End Dragon can essentially provide a quick effect monster negate, and it also has some protection effects on its own, and it's also a very big body. And then of course the Boral Savage, essentially the best Synchro 8 in the game, providing that Omni negate. This has been around in Dragons for quite some time at this point. And then the Branded Regain, of course, just providing some more grind game kind of ability, just being able to not only draw depending on the banish, as well as also just special summoning bodies as well. Now, of course, there's other options that you also have to account for in terms of the end board. You have something like this pattern that's another synchro 10, and this is something that can either like provide a pop or a negate, depending on where you banish from. And the interesting thing with this pattern is that, with, let's say, something like regain, even under something like Dark Ruler, you can actually like bring back this pattern if this was already in the grave, and that's a way for them to play around it. Barone, of course, is just like the best synchro 10 as well, so it provides an omni negate. They can also go into that, especially maybe in a way to play around something like Super Poly, which again we'll get to. IP Masquerena, I assume presumably it's to go into like Unicorn, provide like a spin, and of course Branded Beast provides that pop. A lot of times you're actually going to see Branded Beast and regain, of course, because especially if, let's say, they sent the regain to the graveyard through Serenier's effect and you already have access to Beast, then Beast can just activate that, or rather place. I actually also saw in the survey that some players were thinking about maybe cutting the Beast. I'm not sure how standard that's going to be post banless as well. Now, in terms of the hand traps that the Dragon Link players respected the most as they pilot the strategy, and you can use this also as a guide in terms of, maybe what to side against Dragon Link. And of course, Shifter definitely came out number one. I think it's maybe not in like 100% just because maybe they just feel that, there's just nothing you can do about Shifter. And I'm actually going to switch the wording of this question to make sure that it just reflects maybe just how impactful certain cards are against this strategy. So keep that in mind. Of course, Shifter was definitely the number one thing that all Dragon Link players mentioned. There's just really not that much they can do it. Like Droll, of course, it was also pretty high, and they can definitely try their best to play around it. It looked like in the comments they were definitely a lot more confident in being able to either play around or play through Droll, especially compared to Shifter. Nibiru, of course, yeah, it's definitely good against most combo strategies. A lot of times they'll probably get some kind of negate, but again, something like, let's say, Hermetic Seal, that can actually still trigger under Nibiru just because it did get tributed, and then you'll be able to special summon like a dragon as well. Bestial, of course, similar to the fact that it's good against any light or dark strategies, that also applies to Dragon Link themselves. Lancia can be good. It's just that I think, considering that pretty much no one's playing Lancia at this point for the last little bit, I think that's why they wouldn't be really respecting this. And all the other hand traps kind of low impact against this strategy, because as mentioned in the key strength section, this deck can play through a lot of interruptions that's not Shifter. Next, in terms of the board breakers, so Super Poly is definitely listed as number one. This is kind of interesting because, on one hand, yes, you see that end board with, let's say, like Borderland Dragon and Savage. Those are dark dragons, and you can Super Poly it away for Garura. But as someone who does play Super Poly, I found that oftentimes, because they have something like Regain and that can provide them a body, let's say if it's like Magma, they just get some recovery for the next turn. And, of course, Bestials is very good against something like Branded, which is the main deck that's going to be playing Super Poly. Aside from, let's say, something like Rescue Ace, they can also play it. But other than that, let's say, as mentioned earlier, like this pattern, they can also bring that back, and that's another interruption after getting Super Polyed as well. So certainly not a turn, or rather not a game-ending card outright. Dark Ruler Droplet, of course, it's still good against this kind of boring, right? Like Borderland Dragon, while it has some protection effects on its own, definitely cannot really stop anything through Dark Ruler, and of course being able to get rid of the Omni Negate in Savage is also kind of nice as well. Lava Golem, it's nice to get rid of the big bodies, but again, let's say something like Hermetic Seal, if you were to tribute that off, then it will still be able to special summon and get that effect. Evenly Match is interesting because that's also just like, aside from the fact that if you even got through that Omni Negate in Savage in the beginning with, but usually they'll use Hermetic Seal and they'll just bounce back, let's say something like Regain, so that they have some follow-up for the next turn, and then after Evenly resolves, they can also special after through Hermetic Seal's effect, so it can kind of recover pretty well. Sphere and Kaiju still fall on the same lines of Lava Golem, and the rest of the board breakers really not that impactful. The books, it's good if you're the one that went first against Dragon Link, and then you like book them so that they can't go into like Link monsters. But if they already set up their board and you have books in your hand, it's probably not going to be all that useful, other than maybe getting rid of a Savage Negate. And lastly, in terms of the Floodgates, there can be only one. It was definitely the number one thing that was mentioned in the survey. They are all dragons, so it's going to be very, very deadly. And the thing about there can be only one is that it's also very good against Unchained. So essentially, this might mean that we might see a lot of this, in the side deck with a lot of different lists that can at least actually play There Can Be Only One, such as Branded builds, for example. Summon Limit is going to be good against, most like combo-oriented strategies, or really even mid-range decks as well. Zombie Roll is also quite good because, of course, they do require dragon typing to go into a lot of their extra deck monsters. So this deck, or rather this card, I find is also quite good, even going second against Dragon Link, as long as, because their end board is not nearly as oppressive as it once was in like the very heavy combo versions from a couple of years ago. As long as you can break their board and then just like set up Zombie Roll, it can be a little bit hard for them to climb back as well. Of course, it can play something like Levineer, which can also provide some pops. Anti-Spell can also be pretty decent. Of course, they did get Chaos Space hit to 1, but you know what, they still also have some field spells spells as well, so anti-spell can be impactful depending on the hand, and the rest not too big. I mean, skill drain, of course, sure, it's good against most strategies, but you know what, Dragon Link, they can set up a lot of big beefy bodies even under skill drain, so they can just play a beatdown strategy instead. And something like D-Barrier, definitely don't bother really putting this in post side against them. So now to cover some of the key weaknesses of the deck that the Dragon Link players mentioned, at least the key themes. The first is, of course, as mentioned earlier, the shifter decks. So, you know, they really have a hard time under shifter, especially something like Flunder, which also does have a good matchup against Unchained as well. So Flunder, you're going to see a lot of that in this new format, unfortunately. Normal summon being vulnerable to disruptions. Honestly, this is not unique to Dragon Link. It's funny because, you know, as I've been doing these surveys with a lot of different decks, let's say like, you know, Infernoble, like Vanadium, this kind of comes up a lot, so it's definitely not exclusive to Dragon Link, so keep that in mind. Potential to brick, because a lot of cards that do not do anything on their own. This I really do understand, because especially when you're playing a lot of Bestial, sometimes that's just all you draw, and especially when you're going against a deck that is not light or dark dependent, you know, that's really bad hand, and you won't be able to really do anything. Even like something like Regain or Beast, like they don't do anything on their own. You need like multiple cards in combination with that. Next, Grind Game being weaker, so I assume this is because of the post ban list. You know, the hit to chaos space as well as Magma also being put to 1 definitely can affect the grind game. But at the same time, you know what, like let's say a couple years ago when Striker Dragon got put to 1, which was really big hit for Dragon Link, you know, eventually, while the grind game definitely suffered a lot, eventually they find ways to recover, whether through existing cards or they just always get new cards. Let's say, for example, when the Bestials came out. So you know what, I think, you know, Konami loves dragons clearly, so they're gonna find a way to still make the meta over time. And lastly, this is something I already kind of touched on, you know, just being kind of mediocre if it's a deck that's not light or dark focused, because again, they do play a lot of Bestials, and so, you know, if they are a light dark strategy, they're gonna have a really good time. If you're not, like let's say like Flunder, then it's gonna be pretty challenging, to say the least. And finally, I actually also asked, you know, what are some of the changes that, you know, the players are going to make post-balance because of these couple hits. And of course, again, you know, I'm just trying to pick out some of the answers that were brought up multiple times. The first was to just increase the count for Bestial Senior. It, of course, aside from having that DD Crow kind of like effect like all the Bestials, it is able to dump something like Regain or let's say Beast, but probably Regained to the grave. So that certainly can be useful. Addition of Noctovision Dragon again. Honestly, I didn't even know that this was cut. I was just always used to this, seeing this all the time in Dragon Link. They also mentioned the Red Eyes Black Meteor Dragon and Gamma package. So this is actually a card that came out in Duelist Nexus. So it's like a super rare. I'm sure you recognize it. It looks like it's just a way to kind of like bring out another dragon body. It does say that you have to send a level 5 or higher normal monster, which I assume that's where the driver comes in terms of the Gamma package. So this is certainly one option. And again, you know, if you need this or other singles, you can certainly use my code Hakuna5 for 5% off on Yu-Gi-Oh singles and seal product at Card Brawlers and Tier 0 games. There's also a mention of, you know, adding 1-for-1 as well as Samsara Dragon, which is certainly a card that I was not familiar with. And it, I guess speaking of 1-for-1, it's also a level 1. I guess again, this is just another way to bring out additional dragon bodies. So just finding other kind of extenders, or some players mentioned that they might just increase the count of non-engine, or rather they just don't do anything at all, because Dragon Link typically was played at over 40. So maybe they just use this as a reason to kind of just shut down the deck size. Anyways, guys, that was it for the breakdown of the Dragon Link survey responses. Hopefully you found that helpful, and again, a huge thanks to all of you that responded to that survey. This video really could not have been done without you, and certainly stay tuned for all the other meta strategies that I'll be doing these kind of surveys on. So again, a huge thanks to all of you now for watching the video. Big thanks to my patrons as always for the continued support, and well, take care, guys.